In 2000, Harvard-educated businessman and millionaire Ron Unz faced off in an educational debate with linguist and education professor Dr. Stephen Krashen. These two men came together to discuss the efficacy of Proposition 227, a bill funded and promoted by Unz that had all but eliminated bilingual education in the state of California 2 years earlier, replacing it with a one-year intensive program called Sheltered English Immersion. During the debate, tension mounted as Unz both misrepresented and denounced the scientific evidence that supports why students perform better with multiple years of bilingual education over English-only instruction. He claimed that the theory behind bilingual education is that it takes 7 years to learn English, which is complete nonsense. Dr. Krashen, having researched and studied significantly in the bilingual education field, countered Unz's comment by saying, "That's a distortion. Practically nothing of what you just said is true." During the campaign for 227, whenever Unz appeared on a news show, was aired on a radio broadcast, or wrote an article concerning bilingual education, the misuse and exaggeration of his facts was frequently noted by his opponents. And yet his legislation continued to pass with a significant majority vote in California in 1998, Arizona in 2000, and Massachusetts in 2002. Now, you may be asking yourself, how can this be? How is it that a man who, although well-educated, had little academic knowledge or personal background related to such a controversial issue can somehow overshadow the claims and counter-arguments of researching academics, thereby influencing legislation that affected several regions of the United States? Analyzing Unz's anti-bilingual education campaign can reveal some insights into why legislation that is based on misrepresented, selective, or non-existent empirical evidence manages to succeed at the polls. While other scholars have pinpointed individual reasons for the success of Proposition 227, I investigate and draw connections between a series of factors in hopes that voters will recognize some of the explicit and implicit factors that influence their votes. I hope to accomplish this by first providing context for the Unz campaign, by providing an overview of the contents, arguments, and impacts of Proposition 227. Next, I will identify how historical trends and bias factored into the final poll results. And finally, I will examine the campaign's rhetoric and subject matter and show how, in conjunction with voter ignorance, this led to the success of Proposition 227. So first, a bit of context. Unz's motivation for drafting Proposition 227 stemmed from his concern that immigrant children were not learning English fast enough through their traditional bilingual education system, which gradually increased the amount of English spoken in the classroom, while incorporating the student's first language in order to facilitate understanding. He claimed that students in these types of programs were doing worse on standardized tests and were demonstrating higher dropout rates than their English-only peers. Proposition 227 took students with the same level of English proficiency and put them into what is known as a sheltered English immersion classroom. Such classrooms are taught almost exclusively in English, but they have curriculum that's geared towards English language learners, those whose first language is not English. Proposition 227 mandated that students could only be allowed to stay in these programs for 1 year before being transferred into mainstream English-only classes with native English speakers. At the time, advocates of bilingual education agreed that the system wasn't perfect. However, they typically aligned with people like Massachusetts Representative Jared Barrios, who suggested that the goal for bilingual education reform should not be to end it, but rather to mend it. Such advocates included a slew of prominent academics, education professionals, and politicians, including the President of the United States. Although at the time, bilingual education advocates were greatly supporting the opposition, the advocates could not separate bilingual education from its historical controversy, a factor in 227's success. Historically, bilingual education policy has been controversial because it is often closely tied with American nationalism, security, and immigration. proponents of Proposition 227 may have wanted to nix bilingual education because it is often associated with immigration, as well as the ideology that English should be the only language spoken in the United States. California had already demonstrated some of its anti-immigrant sentiment with the passing of Proposition 187, which, although was later determined to be unconstitutional, would have prohibited undocumented immigrants from accessing public services, like public education. Such sentiment, however, is not the only reason for 227's success. With a landslide victory of 61%, you may be thinking that the opposition was defeated because of lack of funding, or perhaps lack of advertising. However, according to the California Secretary of State's website, proponents of Proposition 227 received about $1.2 million for their campaign, while the opposition received $4.7 million. Not only did the opposition's campaign come to nearly 4 times the size of the proponents, but that site also benefited from the advertising reach of Gerald Parenchio, who used his position as CEO of Univision, the nation's largest Spanish-speaking network, to air editorials 4 times a day against UNS's position. With a sizable budget and a significant amount of advertising, it seemed that the opposition was well equipped to both market its position and garner support for the preservation of bilingual education. The answer here, therefore, doesn't rest in the amount of political backing or advertising that the opposition received, but rather the content of what was aired on the news. Frequently, visual media would depict bilingual education classrooms, and the children were speaking, not in English. Other stations would air sobering comments like this one from a Massachusetts parent, who said that bilingual education students learn every subject in Spanish, and then when they graduate, what do? Such comments may have further fueled people's beliefs that bilingual education students only learn in their first language, which may have contributed to voter ignorance about the true structure of bilingual education. This brings me to my final point, voter ignorance. One of the greatest reasons for Proposition 227's success is voter ignorance about key terms. As interviews and polls later suggested, although the majority of Californians supported a bill that would eliminate bilingual education, many of them did not entirely understand what bilingual education actually means. For example, when prompted to offer what she perceived bilingual education to be, one 227 supporter responded, "Isn't it having their language books translated into English?" No, it isn't. Bilingual education is an umbrella term that refers to a variety of programs, including maintenance bilingual education, transitional bilingual education, additive types of programs, subtractive types of programs, immersion, and dual immersion. With all of these categories, it's reasonable to see why the public was confused about the definition of bilingual education, because the term encompasses a wide variety of programs that all have very different structures, purposes, and goals. UNS was able to capitalize on such voter ignorance and spread his initiatives to other states by presenting test scores that associated higher achievement with the impact of his policies. He frequently cited the statistic that students' test scores had improved by 40% in just 1 year. These quick turnaround statistics, however, do not reflect the results of longitudinal studies, which associate both higher achievement and lower dropout rates with bilingual education. In fact, it has been demonstrated that although students in English-only programs may initially score higher than their bilingual education peers, bilingual education students match the level of achievement of their English-only peers by middle school, and in fact surpass them by high school. UNS's test scores were also inappropriately correlated to the impact of this legislation because bilingual education was not the only factor that changed in the education system that year. Some sources cite California's initiatives to reduce class sizes for younger grades, to increase funding, and to implement phonics-based reading as other contributing factors to the improved test scores. As we have seen, both sides of the debate over Proposition 227 were backed and supported by hefty budgets and had several prominent supporters. However, the opposition was not able to overcome the level of voter ignorance that people had about bilingual education, which was complicated by the historical background of the subject. With this specific example in mind, we can examine how Proposition 227 success, what it implies about the efficacy of the proposition system, and make sure to ask ourselves the next time we head to the polls, how much do I really know about the evidence behind this proposition's claims?